This is unbelievable. Just unbelievable.
Let's bring up the analysis board real quick.
So we've got the analysis board primed and ready to go. But why was Daniel Naroditsky so flabbergasted in that clip? Well, we're going to see in this highly instructive and tense game a real build towards a twist of a finish, and also see how this game fitted into a wider match domination, the likes of which I've never seen in my life. So we had Fabiano Caruana with white, Magnus Carlsen with black. This is the Speed Chess Championship, played a couple months back. Let's see what happened. So d4 from Fabi. Magnus goes d5, c4 the Queen's Gambit, e6 declines it, knight c3 now played, and here we don't see the standard knight to f6, but Magnus goes c5. This is called the Tarrasch defense. Now we had pawn to e3. The most common there is taking on d5. Now this is an ugly move as I'm drawing because it blocks in the bishop, but we'll see Fabi's idea around that later. Knight f6 now played, this one now comes to f3, and now a6 from Magnus sets up these ideas of taking on c4, pushing b5. That would be like a nice Queen's Gambit accepted position. So instead Fabi now takes on d5. Magnus recaptures, the bishop develops here, and now Magnus develops his knight, but a quick one to mention, if black goes c4, well the bishop can drop back, and although you get a quick gain of space, white's going to counter-attack in the centre at the right moment, and that's where they'll get their play. You very often want to meet a flank attack with a centre attack, so that's one way to go for black, but not this game for Magnus. He develops the knight to c6. Now we get castles. This bishop develops here, and now Fabi takes on c5, the bishop recaptures, and he's landed Magnus with an isolated queen's pawn, or IQP for short. And this is the big strategic battle now, where we get b3 on the board from Fabi, so this is how he wants to develop his bishop. Magnus now castles, the bishop develops here, and now queen e7 connects the rooks and also prepares to exchange these bishops, as we'll see. Knight e2 from Fabi, so he opens the eyes of the bishop and looks to blockade this isolated pawn, a very thematic idea. Bishop a3 from Magnus, we see an exchange on a3, the queen recaptures, and now Fabi offers the exchange, Magnus obliges, and this rook comes to the open file. So Fabi's now better, first to the open file, and first to blockade this pawn, as we now see after bishop g4, the knight hits this square, and due to the pressure on c6, Magnus exchanges, the knight recaptures, and he then challenges this file. Now he does succeed in dealing with this pressure on the c file. So after pawn f3, we see a rook trade-off here, this one recaptures, the second one comes to the file, and Magnus gets these off. But Fabi now has the long-term pressure on this pawn, and he starts to squeeze on the position. So he starts with b4, gaining some space. Magnus drops the knight back, and there's a couple of ideas for this journey here. Good play by Magnus. a4 carries on, king f8 improves, and now h4 starts the kingside squeeze as well. Magnus goes h6, the pawn kicks on, and now the king develops into the game, white does the same, and bishop d7 targets the a4 pawn, so it kicks on to a5, and now it clamps those pawns on b7 and a6. Those could be targets for this light squared bishop of white. Knight to c7 now from Magnus, so he goes on this journey, looks at protecting this pawn, also could come to e6, b5 at the right moment, different ideas in the air. g4 from Fabi, another excellent move, but after king f6 from Magnus, here Fabi makes a strange decision. So he could just wait on the position here with a move like king to g3, and if knight e6, you can drop this one back, and you just make black sweat, don't let them liquidate this pawn. But what we see in the game is pawn e4. Magnus gets to liquidate this weakened pawn, not a good move. Now Fabi's idea was that he gets a lot of pressure now down this diagonal. However, he'd obviously overlooked Magnus's defensive idea here, so you can come king e5, you're not forced to protect that pawn, you can counter-attack this knight, and after it drops back, king e3 was technically best by the way, well now you can go knight d5 because the king supports that square. Now there's pressure on this pawn as we can see. Why would your knight leave the defence, which is exactly what Fabi does here? Well, the problem for white is that the bishop is about to hit c6 and cement everything. No issues for black. So instead we see knight e3 now. Fabi wants to get at these pawns. So because of the attack here, Magnus takes the pawn, Fabi chops here, he gets the pressure, but good defense from Magnus. So he starts with bishop c6. He wants to free up this knight from the defense of the pawn. Now Fabi dodges the exchange. We see knight d3 check, the king moves in here, and it now drops back. And this wasn't such a great maneuver because actually you've improved the white king and Fabi can now kick on with the pawns. The king drops back. And now an absolutely star move from Fabi here. But before I show you this one, a quick shout out to the sponsors of today's video who help keep this channel up and running, Aimchess. So I'm not going to give you a ton of waffle, I'm just going to give you 3 quick reasons why they truly are awesome, if you can indulge me 30 seconds here. So number 1, it's free to sign up. Check out the link below, give it a go, see if you like it. Number 2, they will pull in your game data from Chess or chess.com, analyze it and then produce a report which then tailors a training plan to your needs. And number 3, I don't push crap on this channel. I genuinely love the product. So if you do want to check it out, then use the link below. And if you go premium, you can use the code EPIC at checkout and get a great discount in month 1. Now back to this Fabi move. So he kicks on with pawn to g5 check. Now it looks like you're just losing a pawn after takes if Magnus had done this. But here's the trick. You now check on g4 with the knight, an in-between move or a Zwischenzug as we say in chess. And after the king gives ground, it can't come here because of the bishop. Well, then you recapture the pawn and you've now got the opportunity to create an outside pass pawn which is favourable for the side attacking with that pawn. So this is why Magnus, he didn't capture that one. He drops the king back immediately, but now there's a new problem. Fabi captures here, the pawn recaptures, and he lands a knight attacking that pawn. Now he didn't bring the knight to f5 with check, by the way, because then the king attacks the bishop and the knight blocks the retreat of the bishop. So it's quite instructive stuff. So bishop b7 challenges that one on c8. It now drops to f5, the square it can utilise because the knight doesn't block it. But Magnus, supreme as ever, he finds counterplay, goes after the a-pawn. Now we see a captures here, knight captures, we've got a race on our hands and look at the clock times, we're down to seconds. Knight g4 drops back, preparing to run the pawn. Magnus does the same, preparing to run his pawn. The pawn goes, and now the king has to come. You have to come round and try and corral that pawn. And Fabi hops in the knight. So he's covering these squares. He's covering this one with the pawn. But the challenge is, the moment you go here with the pawn, the king comes here and you've got no dark squared bishop. So we see knight d6 from Magnus. He hits that light squared bishop. It drops all the way back here, stops the advance of the pawn past here. a5 from Magnus, and now Fabi starts running his king, but it doesn't really get him anywhere. I mean, one line I was looking at is what happens if knight h5, covering the g7 square and therefore preparing the push. Well, now the king can sidestep across, that one's forced, the knight can come back with check. Now if you come here, you're just repeating the position. Well, what if the king goes to the corner? Now this king can run to f2, try and get round to this side of the board. I mean, the computer gives the position level, but anything can happen in reality. Anyway, perhaps a better try for Fabi, but he goes king g4, we get bishop c6 from Magnus supporting a4, and now king g5, pawn a4, and Fabi struggling down to seconds, he pushes on with this pawn, but he lets the king in now, and how do you actually get rid of that king? So knight h5 check played, the king goes to the corner, Fabi goes like this, he's struggling for a move, but now here comes the bishop, challenging this one. If you exchange, the pawn's going through. So it jumps across this way, the bishop comes back, again threatening an exchange in just a moment. Look how good this knight is defensively as well. King f6 was played, but now bishop b3. The bishop goes, pawn a3, and after king e7, here's a star move from Magnus with seconds on the clock. Knight to e4, it gets a double exclam from chess.com because you're hanging an entire piece, but the piece is immune. if you take, this pawn is going through, it's unstoppable. So instead, Fabi pushes the pawn, he doesn't know what to do. Knight c3 comes, the bishop has finally run out of squares to stay in front of the pawn. And after bishop d3, a2, here we have resignation and Fabi goes down. Now, why is this one of the greatest chess dominations ever? We'll check out the final match score. Just an incredible domination from Magnus, who did not lose a single game against the former world number 2, a guy who was like nearly 28-50 at one point. Truly exceptional. If you want to see another fantastic game between these two guys at the recent World Blitz Championships, then check out this video on screen. Thanks for watching and see you soon.